Hi, and welcome to this lecture on society in a global context. Our goals here are twofold. First, we want to introduce the concept of globalization and emphasize how it looks, at least from the point of view of its proponents. Second, we'll provide an overview of world systems theory, which is a way of examining the phenomenon of globalization from a perspective that is more grounded in historical analysis. But before we delve into any of this, we realize that we are already somewhat familiar with the word globalization. We may, in fact, have a lot of different impressions of what globalization is, without necessarily having any particular sense of the word's specific meaning. We might associate globalization with the diffusion of technology to faraway settings, in part what Canadian social theorist Marshall McLuhan meant when he coined the term global village, to refer how communications media are bringing us closer together. We might also associate globalization with the predominance of global corporations and their brand identities. The knowledge that a McDonald's in Mexico City will essentially be the same as a McDonald's in Whitehorse, or that the Apple logo is a global icon. Globalization might also mean for us a greater awareness of people and cultures very different from our own, and the realization that large cities, almost everywhere, are increasingly meeting places for very diverse peoples. Finally, globalization might bring to mind the reality of how the things we purchase, from fresh fruit to clothing, are more often than not traveling very far to meet us at the checkout counter. All of these impressions are part of the multifaceted reality of globalization. Generally speaking, we can talk about globalization as a worldwide process of growing interdependence and awareness between institutions as well as between individuals. Breaking that out into its component parts, we see, first of all, the idea of an increasingly global culture, thanks in large part to communications technology such as the Internet, in addition to international travel and transportation networks. There are also political dimensions to globalization. On the one hand, we have seen in recent years the emergence of multi-state political and economic organizations such as NAFTA, the European Union, or the Asia Bloc. On the other hand, each individual nation-state in a globalized world is in a relatively weak position next to the immense economic power of transnational corporations. Finally, many economists have argued that our era is characterized by the emergence of a single transnational economy in which the key players are no longer nation-states. One of the most influential proponents of globalization is American sociologist Thomas Friedman, especially in his 2005 book, The World is Flat. Friedman's main point about globalization and the basis for his optimism is more or less summed up in the title of this book. For Friedman, a globalized world is effectively a smaller and more equitable place where the key players are individuals rather than corporations. Friedman and other globalization enthusiasts have come under fire for presenting an incomplete picture of their object of study. You might call it an image of globalization from the point of view of the winners. Other sociologists argue that a complete picture of globalization must come to grips with the inequalities and the conflicts that seem to be part and parcel of the same processes. In particular, there is a powerful argument to be made that what we are calling globalization is really just the current phase of a system that has been evolving for several centuries, and which has always been built, in part, on a structure of unequal relationships between different parts of the world. An alternative explanation for globalization, which places it in a historical context, is that of sociologist Emanuel Wallerstein and what he calls world systems theory. In brief, Wallerstein argues that a transnational social and economic system has been developing since the 1500s. Ever since some powerful nations began to exploit others by way of colonialism and imperialism. Almost from the start, he maintains, the global system has been based on what he calls a global division of labor, despite massive changes in what is produced and traded. For example, 500 years ago, Africa was forced to become involved in the export of slaves to Europe and the Americas, while European countries began to focus on the export of manufactured goods. In the present day, poor countries supply cheap labor in the manufacture of goods for corporations based in rich countries. Think of Nike shoes made in Vietnamese factories by workers making 20 cents an hour that will sell in the US for $180 a pair, and you've got the basic idea. Wallerstein's model divides the world system in three parts. Core states that are highly modernized and more powerful than other states. Peripheral states that are less developed and relatively weak. And semi-peripheral states that are in a middle position. The United States and Canada would be core states. Poor countries of the developing world are classified as peripheral. And Mexico is an example of a semi-peripheral state, prosperous, but structurally not in the same global position as the USA. Here is how Wallerstein's model looks visually, and how he understands the division of labor that is its foundation, namely, the role of the peripheral countries as sources of cheap labor and raw materials. One might reasonably argue that Wallerstein doesn't suitably account for the rise of China, for instance, not only as a source of cheap labor, but also an important manufacturer and exporter of the high-profit consumption goods that Wallerstein sees only originating from core countries. Indeed, the phenomenon of the outsourcing of manufacturing to peripheral countries, generally, is something that world systems theory does not fully grasp. In any case, the strength of world systems theory is to place globalization in a historical context, and as a result to underline that inequality is neither a separate phenomenon from globalization, nor a minor side effect of it, but instead the very basis of it. Another important field of inquiry is to look at anti-globalization movements, and that is what we'll do in this week's seminar, in part through the analysis offered by Benjamin Barber in his article Jihad versus McWorld. Thanks for checking out this lecture.